tide you never valued has gone out, and you are marooned on unsure ground. Something within you has closed down, and you cannot push yourself back to life. You have been forced to enter empty time. There's nothing else to do now but rest and patiently learn to receive the self you have forsaken for the race of days. I suspect these words of John O'Donohue may have a familiar ring for many of us. Have you ever pushed through a busy time only to get sick as soon as the pressure was off? It happens to students after final exams, maybe teachers too, to hosts after busy holidays with house guests, and to workers after important deadlines have finally been met. The test is over, the guests are gone, the project is finished, and suddenly the body rebels. You wake up with the flu, or perhaps the pain of a chronic condition flares up. It's called the letdown effect. After we get through a stressful period, the body finally objects loudly to the distress it has absorbed in its own language of illness. If we have built good habits of self-care into our life, we can handle periods of stress with less likelihood of becoming ill. Maybe you've heard before the story shared in the Time for All Ages about putting the big rocks in your jar first, those things that are important in life, so that your time does not get filled up with what other people want you to be doing. Rest, good food, exercise, close relationships, perhaps a meditation practice. These should be among the first rocks we put in the jars of our lives. In the long run, they help us maximize not only our productivity, but our happiness. Easier said than done, though, right? I have one friend who found that while he was in a high-powered job, the letdown effect happened almost every weekend. He would push so hard to meet high expectations, both his own and others, that by Friday night, he just kind of gave out. He didn't get sick week after week, but he would get home and find he could barely function. He had been forced to enter empty time. He had not a single alleluia left in him. He couldn't even do things he enjoyed, like socializing with friends, unless he first spent long hours sleeping, eating nourishing soups, walking in the woods, and even sitting in a favorite chair, reading quietly while the sun shone on his skin. By the end of the weekend, he might be ready to venture out of his house to be with friends or catch a movie. He finally realized it wasn't healthy for him to have such a chronic cycle of overwork, exhaustion, and recovery. Even if it didn't come to a diagnosable illness, he felt this pattern was not serving him. He was cutting it too close to the bone. I don't think my friend is alone in this. The Protestant work ethic is going strong in America, almost no matter who you are. We get so many subtle messages over our lifetimes that our value lies chiefly in our productivity. Not to mention that being good at what you do is inherently rewarding. But it's kind of a trap. Writer Kirk Byron Jones describes a phenomenon that can result, which he calls the curse of the competent. Jones is speaking to people in the nonprofit sector, but I think his observations apply to many others as well. It happens innocently and slowly, he says. We begin with a burning passion inside to do good, to help people, and to make the world a better place. As we learn more and more about the nature of our good works, we're encouraged to greater proficiency via education and experience. Before we know it, we are asked to do more and more tasks by more and more people. Initially, the feeling of being needed is a great source of satisfaction. But then a cloud begins to settle over our sacred competency. It is a phenomenon I call the curse of the competent. Jones goes on, when we continue to accept these increasing demands, we are no longer ourselves. We are our work. We are no longer persons. We are what we do. The downward spiral begins. The work loses its luster. The requests of people begin to feel like pinches on our skin. Resentment builds inside. The body becomes tired. Important relationships are strained. We begin to wonder why and how our dream turned into a nightmare, and we want out. By the way, this same process can happen with volunteers. It's not limited to paid work. If we don't balance our desire to do good with our need to care for ourselves, burnout is only a matter of time. So I hope all of you super volunteers for Westside, you know who you are, will hear this also, that we don't want you to say yes to every volunteer opportunity at church just because it needs doing by someone. Sometimes you need to say no, or make sure you're part of a team that can share the load, or reevaluate which things you want to do so that what starts out as a joy does not turn into a burden. I think Westside can be a community where we see one another as whole persons, where we all value self-care, where we practice and support one another in making such decisions thoughtfully. So no big requests to Linda and Myron Ice in the near future, okay? What a great auction we had on Friday. I'm so grateful to the Ices and to everyone who helped. And as the auction activity winds down, I do want to honor their need for rest. It helps me to remember how people I admire do take care of themselves. I think of the meditation teacher, Eknath Ishran. He taught people in his writings and retreats to slow down and take your time. And he practiced what he preached. Walks along the Pacific Ocean, repeating a mantra with every step, were a regular part of ashram life. I don't remember now how I learned this, if it was one of his recorded talks or secondhand from one of his long-term students when I worked at the meditation center. But when he was giving a talk or connecting with a group of people, Ishran would just pour himself into meeting the needs of those before him. And afterwards, he needed to replenish his energy. His method, this was Northern California, get into the redwoods and rest among the great trees. Now, in a redwood forest, gazing at the trees, their magnificent size, the wide ridges that line them, their reddish-brown color amid ferns and other deep greens, it puts life into perspective. And as startling as the sight of these great groves is the silence that descends upon you when you enter them. It's a healing hush that invites you simply to be. Silence nurtures body and spirit. I think that's what Ishran was doing among the redwoods, refilling his tank, so to speak, because no human being has an endless supply. If you punch a time card or have peers or supervisors looking over your shoulder, you may have to worry about how many hours you put in, even if after a certain point there is an inverse relationship between hours worked and productivity. But some of us have so deeply internalized the Protestant work ethic that it doesn't matter if anyone else is watching. Our sense of worth is somehow tied to how much time we put in. It's not just a matter of individual psychology, though. The job market demands a lot. The 40-hour work week and the 2-day weekend were adopted, after all, in order to put some limits on how much workers had to work. Not that this entirely solved the problem. Many people, of course, work more than that today, whether they are salaried and exempt from fair labor standards, or perhaps need to cobble together several part-time jobs simply to make ends meet. Everything in our capitalist system tilts toward overwork. It doesn't have to be that way, though. I read about one startup that established a 32-hour work week as the standard week for its full-time employees. And I have a friend who decided working fewer hours was healthier for her. She lives very frugally and sticks with one part-time job. It can be done. But I found that for myself, what's at least as important to monitor and self-regulate as my time is my energy. What gives me energy? What depletes my energy? Is it time for me to rest so that I can come back refreshed and creative and present? That's what Ishran was doing among those redwoods, allowing the strength of the great trees to flow into him. Spiritual leaders have been setting this kind of example for a very long time. In the Christian tradition, the Gospel of Mark tells of Jesus sending his disciples out among the people. Later it says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Several verses later, after presiding over the miracle of the loaves and fishes, as he so often does in the gospel accounts, Jesus himself goes up on the mountain to pray. This is the example set forth. After completing their task, the spiritual leader and disciples all take time for rest and renewal. They nurture their own wholeness. They take a holy rest. I think most of us realize we should do this. We have good intentions, and maybe some of you are better at it than I am. Yet pacing ourselves and staying balanced is still challenging for many Americans. It just goes against the grain. I have a vivid memory of expressing this viscerally myself about 10 years ago. The setting was a visit to a Reiki energy healer. I sensed that I voiced a common feeling when on the Reiki table, my energy is unlocking and my feelings unblocking, I spontaneously cried out, "It's never enough! It's never enough." In that moment in my life, that was how I felt about the work I was doing in philanthropy. That no matter how much I accomplished, the hard-driving business leaders and professionals that surrounded me, people whose lives were measured in billable hours and community awards, would always want yet more from me. And perhaps I would want more for myself. Fortunately, there was some other common ground among us. At the community foundations I served, everyone understood what it meant to be a trustee of the financial assets that we managed. We all knew that we needed to protect the endowments for the future earnings they would produce. But if we got overzealous about current needs and took too much out for grant programs, it would cut into the principal. Whereas if we took a more modest amount out each year, the principal would be preserved and continue to generate money for grants in perpetuity. The long-term benefit to the community would actually be greater that way. So we had to exercise prudence, weighing the needs of today and the needs of tomorrow. I think our lives are like this too. Our most fundamental asset, our store of life energy, is like the principle of an endowment. We should be living only off the interest. We must be careful not to cut into our own principle, so to speak. If such a loss is unavoidable, as happens occasionally, we should allow extra time for the principal to be replenished and for new earnings to accrue before further withdrawals are made from our store of life energy. Otherwise, we'll have less to share with others and simply to enjoy our life. We may even die too young of preventable lifestyle diseases. Holy rest doesn't necessarily require a long period of time. It may come in the form of some regular, brief spiritual practice. It could involve spending time in nature. In the passage from Mark, Jesus and the disciples renewed themselves by praying on the mountain, lying still in a deserted place. It can be so simple. Even apart from the influence our culture may exert on us to work, 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 some of us are prone to overwork for other reasons. Passionate people, especially, like entrepreneurs, earnest parents, and social activists, may find it hard to slow down. At their best, such people are driven not by a sense of lack or by cultural forces, but by vision and an inner drive to make a difference. But whatever the cause, an imbalance of activity and rest still has the same effect. No one is immune to the need for holy rest. Just the opposite, when we are tackling urgent and intractable problems like global climate change or racial justice, like gun violence or rape culture, it is all the more important that we pace ourselves and periodically renew our spirits. Because such work is emotionally very taxing, and the systems of extractive capitalism and racism, violence and sexism are deeply entrenched. We know there will be no quick fixes. So if the age of Trump has whipped you into new frenzies of activism, which I could understand, that makes it all the more important to find times to be excessively gentle with yourself, as O'Donohue put it. We will not have staying power in our activism unless we have spiritual power in ourselves. One activist, organizer, and as it happens, Unitarian Universalist that I admire is Chris Krass, author of Towards Collective Liberation. A few years ago, Chris spoke openly about his struggle to balance personal healing with social justice work. He wrote, "While I intellectually believed that activists need to find balance, I still felt the drive to keep going, growing down beyond what was healthy." In a blog interview, Chris shared, "As I was working nationally to build up social justice organizations and support hundreds of new activists, I was also hiding, alone and scared, with chronic anxiety attacks, which had become so acute I even had moments of suicidal feelings creep in." Over a period of several years, this changed for Chris as he learned to be in the world in a healthier way, as he put it. He read books on trauma and spirituality, ate and exercised regularly, got therapy, prayed often, and attended worship at his UU church more consistently. This activist who has inspired so many others at times had to persuade himself that doing all these things was a good time management strategy because panic attacks would take more time than the good self-care that could prevent them. But here's the conclusion that Chris ultimately came to. "I deserve to be whole, healthy, and happy," he said, "not just because of how that will make me more useful, but because we want fully alive people in the world, and I'm one of those people." Yes, we do want fully alive people. I'm one of those people, and so are each of you. May we each develop our own healthy rhythm of activity and stillness, work and rest, so we can be fully alive. May we heed the example of those leaders we admire, seeking holy rest. May we remember this wisdom of John O'Donohue and his blessing for one who is exhausted. Take refuge in your senses, open up to all the small miracles you rushed through. Imitate the habit of twilight, taking time to open the well of color that fostered the brightness of day. Draw alongside the silence of stone until its calmness can claim you. Be excessively gentle with yourself. Stay clear of those vexed in spirit. Learn to linger around someone of ease who feels they have all the time in the world. Gradually, you will return to yourself, having learned a new respect for your heart and the joy that dwells far within slow time. May it be so.